There you go.
And just so everyone knows, we are recording this workshop. This workshop is a part of a series of webinars and other workshops and trainings that the UUA is preparing, putting together, and recording to create a database to provide to pastoral care providers, to religious professionals, and also to lay pastoral care providers during this time in which we are needing to find different ways to care for one another than the ways in which we've always relied on when we could be in person with one another. So my name is the Reverend David Pyle. I am the regional lead for the Mid-America region of the UUA. And I am also, I'm a Unitarian Universalist parish minister, and I have served congregations in Illinois, Michigan, and Southern California. And on the UUA staff, I have served as a congregational life consultant and district executive in the Central East region of the UUA, and a congregational life consultant in the New England region of the UUA before coming back to where I started, which was my first role on a district staff was on the Central Midwest district staff back in the aughts. So it is beautiful that earlier this church year I was invited to come back to serve on the Mid-America region staff again. It's great to be with you, and thank you, Lisa, for managing our tech this evening. Lisa and I have been in so many different relationships over the years. Lisa was my district executive when I was serving a congregation in Midland, Michigan. So I also wanted to let you all know that I am actually in a hotel room in upstate New York at the moment, because at the moment I am actually on active duty for the United States Army. I serve as a reserve U.S. Army hospital chaplain, and I have been up here for the past week with a group of soldiers to field hospitals that are preparing to deploy, to go to different sites across our country to assist in the medical care for in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's been a beautiful thing. The Mid-America staff has been able to make that seamless for us. And it's been a beautiful thing for me to be able to be with my soldiers. As of this time, I'm not going with them. I'm just here to help them prepare. But I wanted you to know why I'm in a hotel room in upstate New York at the moment. So this workshop, like I said, it's part of a series of webinars and workshops and trainings that we've been creating and putting together to help our congregations to address the unique pastoral care needs that exist within our congregations during the time of this pandemic. So many of the ways in which we rely on one another are disrupted by the patterns of social distancing. And at the same time that many members of our congregations are experiencing their own isolation, their own experience of this national trauma that we're experiencing. So as pastoral care needs have risen, our ability to respond to them is shifting and changing. And so I encourage you to go on the Leader Lab section of UUA.org and also on the COVID-19 resources page of UUA.org and see all the resources that are being created by multiple different UUA staff and other members of our faith, religious professionals and lay leaders, to help you all to address the pastoral care needs within your congregations. This workshop is a specific one. It actually was designed in its initial form prior to this pandemic. And it was intended to be a workshop for religious professionals and lay pastoral care providers to help congregations through times of crisis and challenge and conflict. Because pastoral care becomes of deep importance when there is some great tragedy in the community, when there is a conflict, a major conflict within the congregation. And so this workshop is a training that we have done in person several times, but this is the first time it will have been presented virtually. But I want us to begin us with a reading. If everyone would take a deep breath from all the busyness and everything else that is happening in our world, just take a deep breath. And I bring us this prayer, this meditation. We Need One Another by George Odell. We need one another when we mourn and would be comforted. when we are in trouble and afraid, when we despair, in temptation, and need to be recalled to our best selves again. We need one another when we would accomplish some great purpose and cannot do it alone. In the hour of our successes, when we look for someone to share our triumphs, and in the hour of our defeat, when with encouragement we might endure and stand again. We need one another when we come to die and would have gentle hands prepare us for the journey. All our lives we are in need, and others are in need of us. Take a deep breath with me. So the purpose of this webinar is to explore the emotional, spiritual, professional, and communal needs of religious professionals and lay pastoral care providers during congregational crisis, community crisis, trauma, and conflict. To name the ways in which religious professionals and lay pastoral care providers prepare for times of crisis, trauma, and conflict in congregations. To understand how to engage with pastoral needs during a congregational crisis, trauma, and conflict at the levels of I, thou, and we. You can do the hand motions with me if you want. I, thou, and we. It's to have a framework for engaging the congregation in constructive pastoral care during a congregational crisis or community crisis, and to allow for a natural progression from pastoral care in the case of congregational conflict, from pastoral care to conflict engagement when that is needed. Those are the goals of this workshop. One of the things I want to say is that these slides are built to also be notes, and we will be, for everyone who registered, we will be sending a copy of these slides out to everyone. And of course, the recording is going to be put on uua.org. It might actually be broken up in a couple different pieces, but the recording will be on uua.org within a couple of days. But all the slides, all the slides can be notes. Now, of course, you can take notes if you wish. That is fine. Also, we will, I think my email address is in this, but we will make sure that you have that if at the end of this webinar, if there are questions or concerns that come to you in the next coming days or weeks, I am one of your congregational life consultants and would love to be able to be in conversation with you about that. There may also be some specific challenges that your congregation is facing. And I would encourage you to be in conversation with your congregation's primary contact on the regional staff. I'm not going to go through who all the primary contacts for which congregations, but you can always go to the Mid-America section of uua.org to be able to determine who is the right person to reach out to. And I will say this, on our staff, you reach out to whoever you know to reach out to, and we'll figure out how to get you to the right person to help you. So in this webinar, I'd like to ask that if you have questions that are on the content specifically, as we're going through the content, you ask those questions in the chat. Lisa Presley is going to be monitoring the chat, and Lisa will slow me down enough that Lisa can answer that question, and I'll engage it as we go on. At the end, if we have time, we will also have time to be able to engage, questions where we unmute people or let people unmute themselves, and we can engage questions that way. For some, the ideas in this webinar will be a refresher for you, and for others, it will be new. All of us are on a different place in our journey and our experience in learning to be pastoral care providers. Some of the features of Zoom, like the ability to chat with anyone other than the host, or to one-on-one chat with people, may have been disabled. And that's for your safety, and for us to be able to know that we're providing a safe space for people to be able to come in and learn and engage. So after the webinar, there's my email address. I knew it was in here somewhere. After the webinar, if there are questions that are more specific, feel free to reach out to me or to your congregation's primary contact. The Mid-America Regional staff is always available for coaching during times of crisis, trauma, and conflict. And I will say one of the things that is most helpful to us in helping you and your congregation is to have the lay pastoral care providers have had some training like this, to be able to assist us when we are working with a congregation during a time of crisis, challenge, or trauma. So I'm grateful for all of you that are here tonight. And like I said, the slides are designed to be notes, and they will be sent out to all who are registered. I also, if you watch, I have fun transitions in this PowerPoint. So if you didn't see that one, I'm going to let you see it again. It comes back and then it flies away. I don't know how well it's showing up in Zoom. Sometimes it didn't show up that well, but it's the paper airplane that flies away. I want to begin by talking about when the crisis is the religious professional's own. Because one of the challenges that happens in ministries sometimes is that sometimes a religious professional is experiencing a crisis in their own life. Whether it's a conflict that they're experiencing or a medical issue, and yet the religious professional, it is considered the best of boundaries to be able to not have the religious professional going to their congregation to receive pastoral care. That they're receiving that pastoral care in other spaces, from colleagues, from regional staff, from spiritual directors and others, because the care relationship that is critical to the practice of ministry is the minister in the caring role with the congregation. Now, that doesn't mean a congregation doesn't care about or for their minister, but it's about the formal relationship of receiving pastoral care. And I start off with this line because I want to name, both to the religious professionals that are on the call, this necessary boundary aspect of keeping the relationship of ministry within congregations appropriate, but also to ask you as congregation members to help ministers do this, help ministers maintain that appropriate boundary around care. This time period of the pandemic is a time period in which there are significant challenges for many of us in our lives, and some of them are religious professionals. And I use the term religious professional because that may be a minister, that may be a religious educator, that may be a music director or a membership professional or a church administrator, those who have made a profession of serving our faith communities. Most ministers are able to find that personal community of religious professionals among their other colleagues to assist them in a personal crisis. And it's a vital role that colleagues play during a crisis in a religious professional's life, is to be that support for your other religious professional colleagues, both within a congregation and cross-congregational lines. I also want to name that there is a wonderful fund that many congregations donate to every year called the Service of the Living Tradition Fund, which is a fund to help with financial support and other support for religious professionals when they are experiencing a crisis in their own lives. But one last thing to say. When there is a crisis or a trauma or a conflict in a congregation, that can also create a crisis, trauma, or conflict in the religious professional's personal life. And the two are sometimes very difficult to separate, right? So if a congregation is going through their own conflict, or a community is going through a crisis, it can sometimes be difficult for people to see the difference between what is the crisis that is in the religious professional's personal life and the congregational crisis. So I'm just naming this need for us to be able to hold this boundary well. I also want to begin with another note, especially, and this is a new slide. This is a slide that I put in specifically for the national experience we are having now. And that is that trauma activates trauma. Many of us have had traumatic experiences in our lives. They could be very personal traumatic experiences. They could be traumatic experiences that many people shared. But many of us have experienced, either in our childhood, in our adult lives, in different aspects of our lives, we've experienced different forms of trauma. Sometimes it's physical trauma, injuries to the body. Sometimes it's mental health trauma. Sometimes it's spiritual trauma. For a long time, many people came to Unitarian Universalism after having been wounded in another faith tradition. What I want to name is that trauma activates trauma. Is that whenever there is a traumatic experience happening either in a congregation or in a whole nation or in a whole world like we're experiencing right now, it is natural and normal for people to feel those traumas in their own past, those traumas that they've experienced in their lives, to feel them become more active, to feel them more intensely than they might at other times, because of trauma activating trauma. So if I have had, and I'll just name a little bit about myself, I served as a peacekeeper in Bosnia in 1996 and 1997, and was part of the peacekeeping force that uncovered and documented some of the war crimes that occurred in Bosnia, and came back from that experience with some of my own trauma from that, and was blessed to have some great counselors from the VA. And frankly, that experience in Bosnia was what began me on the path that eventually led me to Unitarian Universalist ministry and to serving both as a trauma chaplain in hospitals, as a hospice chaplain, and now as an Army chaplain and on regional staff working with congregations during very difficult times. And this national trauma has had me reliving some of those experiences that I have had from my time period serving as a peacekeeper in Bosnia in 96 and 97. That's one example. So as pastoral care providers, what I wanted to bring up here was the reality that people that we are providing pastoral care for may be living traumas that have nothing to do with the pandemic, but are activated by this national emergency. Traumas that are buried in, that are deep in other parts of their life and their life experience, but are activated by this national emergency. I also want to say that grief works in a very similar way. One of my great blessings was to serve as a hospice chaplain in Chicago. And one of the things I learned from that experience was that we grieve, whenever we have a loss, we grieve every loss we've ever had. Because grief is an emotion, not an event. And so when we begin to feel that emotion of a grief or a loss, it brings up all those other losses we have had. I know that in doing pastoral care with some of my hospice patients, I had the privilege to be with them as they were doing life reviews, as they were looking at things like all of the grief, all of the losses they carried in their lives. And what really struck me was it was never just the grief at their coming towards the end of their life, but that emotion brought up all the other losses they had experienced. So when you're doing pastoral care in this time where we are in a national emergency, where people are experiencing grief, people are experiencing trauma, realize that pastoral care that we do is not simply about this grief and trauma, it's about all the others. So what is a congregational crisis, trauma, or conflict? A national event that challenges the values of our faith, creates significant dislocation of congregants. I think the last month and a half qualifies. The unexpected deaths of those connected to a congregation by violence, trauma, or suicide. We have begun to have Unitarian Universalists die of this disease. Unitarian Universalists and congregations in Mid-America. And I wish I could tell you that that wasn't going to continue, but it is. A congregational crisis, trauma, or conflict can be a congregational conflict where a side of that conflict, and sometimes both sides of that conflict, believe that they cannot remain in the community. Where the conflict has reached a point where somebody has to leave for others to feel like they can stay. Another kind of event that we're speaking of today is significant accidental or intentional destruction of church property. You know, our churches are our religious home, and yes, we say that, and it is true that the church is not the building, the church is the people, and right now we're all kind of living in that a bit. You know, somebody said to me the other day that church has become Zoom, but the reality is a lot of us attach deep meaning to the physical space of our congregations, and so damage to that physical space, especially when it's intentional, can be a congregational crisis, trauma, or conflict. An act of violence within the church. This can be very strong. This can be very obvious violence. It could also be emotional violence that exists sometimes within our congregations. An existential financial challenge, where the financial challenge is such that it is unknown whether the congregation can continue to be a congregation, can be this kind of congregational crisis, trauma, or conflict. Misconduct by a religious professional or a trusted lay leader. Not going to do a whole webinar on congregational religious professional misconduct right now, but I will say that misconduct usually comes in one of three different kinds, and those are sexual misconduct, financial misconduct, and what I call emotional misconduct or emotional abuse by a religious professional. That is a kind of crisis, trauma, or conflict that a congregation experiences. A trauma in your local community, which affects those connected to the congregation. I named in an example the congregations that have been in local communities where there have been mass shootings, where maybe no one in the congregation was directly impacted by the mass shooting. But the fact that this happened in our town, near us. So many of our congregations, not all, but so many of our congregations have deep connections to local educational institutions, to universities and colleges. And so there have been those times where those mass shootings occurred in those educational institutions, have been deeply, profoundly impactful towards those congregations that have experienced that. A situation where a significant number of those connected to the congregation feels like the congregation has violated its own values. That can be a traumatic experience on both sides of that. People that are traumatized by the fact that people believe the congregation did this, even though they don't believe that. And the people who believe that this congregation they've invested their own sacred values and beliefs into did something that they could not ethically or morally justify. All of these are the kinds of things that when we think about congregations going through significant crisis, trauma, or conflict, all of these are the kinds of things that we see. And there may be others that we haven't seen yet. Other ways that congregations experience this kind of time of crisis, trauma, or conflict. Lisa, were there any questions in the chat or?
Not so far.
Okay, thank you. So in thinking through how to help pastoral care providers, lay or professional, to think through how to do response to these kinds of congregational crises, traumas, or conflicts, I found it helpful to work with them on three levels of understanding how we respond and how we understand the needs of the congregation. And we did them in hand signs a little earlier, right? I, thou, and we. So under I as a pastoral care provider in this congregation might be a lay pastoral care associate or a caring committee member, might be I might be a religious professional, I might be the religious educator, I might be the music director, I might be the minister. I might even be I will tell you, I used to be a church administrator for a small UU congregation in Texas. The amount of pastoral care that church administrators do boggles the mind. And pastoral care, not just for members, because the administrator is the one that's there most times, but also the pastoral care that comes to the door, that is from the community, that somebody is just having their heart broken or having a crisis in their life, and something in them says, I just have to go to a church right now. And so on a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., they knock on the door and it's the church administrator who answers. So realize when I say religious professionals, I mean not just our ministers or our religious educators or our music directors or our membership professionals. So the first question, and these are formed as questions that I need to be asking myself in the midst of this congregational crisis, in the midst of this community conflict, this community crisis. What are the questions I need to be asking myself to make sure that I am centered and prepared to be a pastoral care provider in this time? First one is, what do I need to do to remain centered and present as a religious professional or a lay pastoral care provider amidst this congregational crisis? A few years ago, I had the privilege to serve as one of the U.S. Army chaplains that responded to the mortuary services teams at Dover Air Force Base when a service member who had been killed overseas was coming home. And I was one of the chaplains that would meet their family and take them from the airport in Philadelphia to Dover and to be with them through the experience of receiving the remains of their fallen loved one. And one of the things they did at every single one of those times, they would call us. And the first question they would ask was not are you available? The first question they would ask is, how is it with your soul? And in that moment, they really did charge us to look at, to take an inventory of where we were, what emotional space we had, what crises were happening in our own lives, and look and see if there was the space within us to be able to be with that family that was there to receive their fallen loved ones. That's an extreme example. I will tell you, doing that ministry was always very rewarding, difficult but rewarding. But I think the same kind of assessment needs to be true for us, for all kinds of pastoral care providers. What space do I have within me to respond to the needs of those for whom I care amidst this congregational crisis? Second question I think we need to ask in determining where we are is, am I capable of remaining centered and present as a religious or lay professional amidst this crisis? This one comes up a lot in conflict situations in congregations, because we're not just lay pastoral care providers or professional pastoral care providers. We're often members of the congregation, and we have probably our own opinions about whatever the congregational conflict or crisis is that's going on. And it's asking myself the question, am I able to step aside from that opinion that I may have and make the space to be able to be a pastoral care presence, even for people whom I disagree with amidst this congregational crisis or conflict? And sometimes the answer to that question is no, right? And the purpose of I is to look deeply at, what do I have to offer in this time? I always say to my lay pastoral care providers, and for religious professionals, it's a little different. For the lay pastoral care providers, I always say, it's okay to say you don't have it on this one. Because I would rather someone not provide the pastoral care, not be the person called upon in that instance, than to go into a pastoral care situation that you're not prepared for. that could be damaging to you or to other people. So the next question is, who are my supports in remaining centered and present amidst this congregational crisis? Who do I have to support me? No one should do pastoral care alone. No one should do pastoral care alone. It's one of the primary boundaries that I hope that we're setting in place in doing pastoral care programs, that we are always in relationship to other pastoral care providers, be they lay or professional, that we are always in communication, especially if you're a lay pastoral care provider in a congregation that does have a religious professional pastoral care provider or two, that you're in a relationship of accountability with that professional pastoral care provider. Because none of us should be in a position where we are without those supports, without someone that we can go to ask, am I holding good boundaries here? Am I indecent? Am I remaining centered? I'll tell you, one of the blessings I had in one of the congregations I served out in California, we had a congregational conflict. It wasn't a huge one, but we had a congregational conflict. And one of my lay pastoral care providers was married to one of the main protagonists in the conflict. And that person came to me without me prodding and said, I don't think I can help with this one. I will tell you, they actually didn't agree with their spouse. But because that spousal relationship was so important, and it is so important, that had to be the priority over them being actively involved as a pastoral care provider in that moment. Who are your supports? I ask you to think through that now. Maybe it's other lay pastoral care providers. Maybe it's religious professionals, pastoral care providers in your congregations. For the religious professionals, I hope it's your colleagues. I hope it's the regional staff. I hope maybe it's a spiritual director or even a therapist, because I'll tell you, therapy works. And I love, some of the best pastoral care providers are people who have done some good therapy on what they bring in their own life. And this gets to the last question. To who am I accountable to help me remain centered and present amidst this congregational crisis? Who can tell me when I'm wrong? Who can tell me when I need to step back? To who am I accountable? Moving from I, we then move to thou, to the other, to the sacred other, to those we care for. And the first question in thou is, how do I listen and be present to each person individually through the midst of this congregational or community crisis? One of the key words there is individually. How do I make sure that I'm present, that I've let go of the things that are concerning to me about whatever the circumstance, the crisis is, so that I'm privileging that other person and their experience in this time? Pastoral care is different than being friends with someone. Pastoral care, as I say in another workshop that's on uua.org, pastoral care is intentional compassion within boundaries. Intentional compassion within boundaries of practice. Representing your congregation and your faith community. So we may be having our own experiences, and I could meet with my friend AJ. I have a great friend named AJ. He's a Roman Catholic priest, also a fellow military chaplain. And he and I can meet, and we can go have coffee, and we can talk, and we can complain about the Army, because we do that. And we can, complain about our congregations and see the ways that they're the same and they're different, and our faith tradition, I will not ever say that he complains about the Pope, and I never complain about Susan Frederick Gray. But we can do that. That's not pastoral care. Because in that friendship, in that relationship, we're doing a mutual friendship. one of us is not privileging the other person's experience in that moment. Does this land? Does this make sense? In pastoral care, you are privileging the other person's experience. You are listening to them. You are focusing your attention on them, and you are holding back, using that as an opportunity for your own processing. So how do I listen and be present to each person individually through this congregation or community crisis? Here's a question I added. How does using virtual technology change how I can listen? I'll tell you, I'm living this one myself, right? This is my second workshop to do today. I taught a class for the Army earlier today, and half the group was in the room and the other half of the group was all on Zoom in different parts of the country. And, you know, how do I read people on Zoom? Because I'm so used to being able to read a room, to see how the emotions are working, to see how people are interacting with each other, to see when the eyes look like I just said something that they can't stand. None of that really translates in Zoom. I have learned one thing about Zoom and virtual technology, though, and that is that if I have been in a room with someone before, if I've been physically present with them, then I can read them on Zoom better. I can read them through virtual technologies better. I can see their body language. I can imagine their body language because I've been physically present with them before. So how we do pastoral care through virtual technology, and I mean that phone too. In some ways, I think phone is easier because your brain knows you don't have the body language. So it actually pays a little more attention, I think, to audio cues and, you know, what one of my pastoral care professors used to call pastoral cooing. Ha, oh, right? Zoom tricks our brain into thinking we're getting more information than we actually are. So thinking through how do I, if I can't be physically present with them in this time of social distancing, in this time where people in our congregations may be in isolation, maybe under quarantine, and yet still need connection, still need pastoral care, how can we use this virtual technology to be able to maintain those relationships? There was a poem by one of our Unitarian Universalist ministers in Oregon that has stayed with me. I'm just going to give you one line. She said that her name is the Reverend Marcia Stannard, and she said, this technology we thought was killing us may be what saves us through this time of social distancing. So how can I help to draw out each person's individual experience and feelings while not interjecting and privileging my own? Because there's a natural human tendency to want to share stories, right? And it's a natural bonding experience. And sometimes it's not a bonding experience. Sometimes it's one-upsmanship. And I know that I'm guilty of that sometimes, right? You know, well, you thought your day was terrible. I mean, gosh, we know that pattern in humanity, right? And that is a normal human pattern. Sometimes it's annoying. I know it really annoys my wife when I do it. But it's not pastoral care. Because pastoral care is about privileging the other person's experience for that time, for that space, making that moment about them and what they're experiencing. Intentional compassion within boundaries, representing the faith community. That doesn't mean you can't share something that you really have discerned could be useful to them, could be a place that they can anchor. But that is not an excuse to turn a pastoral care experience into an opportunity for you to process your own stuff. Because this is about them. So how can I focus? And we're gonna talk about a technique during this workshop in a little while for doing this. A technique that I use. I actually learned from Army religious affairs specialists and sergeants, what we used to call chaplain assistants. A technique called question-focused listening. But the core question here is, how do I help draw the person's individual experience out and feelings while not privileging or interjecting my own? What do I do when I feel my own emotions and feelings reacting to someone else's? It's a very natural tendency. There's two versions of this. It's a very natural tendency sometimes for us to sync our emotions with the people we are with people in pastoral care. This is compassion. The word compassion translates as feeling with someone. When someone is having a terrible experience, feeling enough of that terrible experience reflected in ourselves to identify with that experience and with them is at the core of compassion. Compassion is a beautiful thing, and it is the purpose. Pastoral care is intentional compassion. How do we do that intentionally? And by doing that, what we mean is, how do we hold that feeling with, that compassion, in a way that allows it not to run away with us? Because we are holding the space for them to feel. We are holding the opportunity for them to feel, rather than us being swept away by that feeling ourselves. So we're also going to do another technique in a little while that helps with this. But there's another version of this, and this is the one that is actually the harder one for pastoral care providers, professional or lay, to hold. And that is when the feeling that we are having to their story is maybe diametrically opposite to theirs. Some examples of what I mean by this. When someone is telling me a story, and I spend a lot of time doing pastoral care with soldiers, and some of my soldiers are not of the same political spectrum as I might be. I will tell you, I serve in medical command, so there are a lot of people in medical command who actually would feel quite comfortable in Unitarian Universalist congregations. But some of my soldiers are of different cultural and political experiences that are different than my own. And in doing pastoral care with them, I have to be able to hold that, where they may be sharing a deep experience for them that has profound meaning, and inside me, I am horrified because based on my own values and principles. But if I interject that, then I am making the pastoral care experience about me, not about them. How do I do my own work so that I am able to be present to them? I am able to bear witness to their experience without injecting those emotions that I'm experiencing in that moment. Part of that is I need a place to process that. I need somewhere else to go to. I need those relationships of accountability. I need those relationships of support so that I have a space that I can go process those experiences. But the other piece is really deeply adapting to and abiding by that idea that pastoral care is about the other person. And I will say this, I had a chaplain, a fellow chaplain that I was in a pastoral care relationship with. And he was Southern Baptist. And views and beliefs were profoundly different than mine. But I was in that pastoral care relationship with him for a couple of years. And the act of my remaining present, of my not interjecting my values and beliefs, profoundly impacted him. I don't know that it is a direct one-for-one correlation, but that chaplain is now endorsed by the United Church of Christ and is a lot more, we agree on a lot more now than we did a decade plus ago. There is a power at being present that is its own message. And how do I interact with my fellow pastoral care providers in providing a unified response and working with individuals? So this is one of the things I recommend in another training and workshop, is that pastoral care providers, a pastoral care team, come to shared boundaries, scope, and practices of care. That you set the similar patterns. One pattern that we had in a congregation I served in Ventura, California was no pastoral care interview went longer than an hour. And we set that expectation across all of ours. That's an easy one. We set another one that no pastoral care interview occurred in private homes, except when there were medical reasons or ability reasons to do so. That was in part for the protection of our lay pastoral care providers. So how do we set a standard set of practices? We're not going to do that workshop today, but I wanted you all to think about that. We move on to all of us together. Confidentiality is a complicated thing in Unitarian Universalist congregations. Why does confidentiality exist? Confidentiality exists so that people can do good work, that they can have the space to be able to do necessary heart and soul work. And confidentiality should not and cannot prevent a pastoral care provider from receiving the support they need from other pastoral care providers to be able to not only do good pastoral care, but also to process their own reactions to the pastoral care that they do. Do you see the difference between these two? So I always have made the agreement with my lay pastoral care teams that I was included, as the minister, I was included in anything that all of their interactions in lay pastoral care included me. And we did this by beginning pastoral care programs, pastoral care conversations and relationships by having the lay pastoral care provider say, I just want you to know that Reverend David is going to be, I'm going to be talking with Reverend David about the things we talk about so that I can best be present with you. And that maybe that we know then when it may be appropriate for Reverend David to come and engage with you. Now, this is difficult and different in congregations that are lay-led, that do not have professional pastoral care. But even in that circumstance, what I encourage congregational pastoral care providers to do, especially as relates to crisis response, is to say, I want you to know that at the beginning of a pastoral care relationship, to say, I need you to know that I'm going to be going back to the other group of lay pastoral care providers to process my own reactions to some of the things that we may do together in these pastoral care. And so that any of them, if something were to happen to me, any of them could step in and be in a pastoral care relationship with you, representing the congregation. How do we, and that's one way that the stories come back. Another way the stories come back is by helping people. One of the great things about pastoral care, especially in times of crisis and trauma, is that you are helping people become comfortable with sharing their own stories. By people sharing their experience with you, by people talking with you about the challenging times that they are going through, you are helping them become prepared to share that story, to share their experience, to share their truth in a broader way. And there's a wonderful, if anyone is ever interested in going really deep in crisis and trauma engagement, there's a program called, one type of engagement called CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management. And I'm not asking you all to go out and become CISM qualified trainers, but one of the core elements of CISM is that it is in telling our stories together that we heal as a community. It's in telling our stories to one another that we see that we are more alike than we are different, and that we are able to hold, especially crisis and trauma, in a deeper way. One of the regular practices of conflict engagement, especially when a conflict in a congregation has gotten very, very heated and people may have left, is to make the space for people to come back and tell their truth, tell their experience, tell their stories. But most people need some practice to be able to do that. Most people need to be able to have a pastoral care relationship to process some of that before they can be comfortable sharing those experiences within the congregation. Sharing that could be a deeply wounding experience with anyone else. And that's one of the roles that lay pastoral care providers play, is helping people to become that comfortable in that way. And this is also how ritual and worship can be utilized, not just within the congregation or a worship setting. Ritual and worship can be important for lay pastoral care providers, but especially during crisis and conflict, to be able to bring those experiences together into the whole, and to use a religious word to sanctify them, to name them as a part of the divine and bring them back into the whole. This is also one of the ways that we help members of the congregation to hear one another. One of the things that we, the Mid-America regional staff, one of the techniques that we love is a technique known as circle process. And for those of you that maybe know Phil Lund, one of our regional staff consultants, Phil does a lot of our training in circle process. And it is a way in which we can all hear each other's truth, that we make the space to be intentionally in relationship with one another in a way that leaves room for everyone to share their experience. I see there are a couple of things in the chat. We'll come back to that in just a minute. I'm going to run through this slide, but Lisa, I'll be asking to see what there's in the chat in a moment. But for circle process to be helpful, people have to be willing to hear each other. And another part of a lay pastoral care provider's role in times of crisis and trauma, and in particular conflict, is doing some emotional processing with people. Let people be able to talk about their experience, so that they can get to the point that they can actually hear other people. That their own understanding of what is the truth, or what is right, or what is the only thing that could happen gains a little bit of porousness. That maybe they're able, that maybe through pastoral care with lay providers or professional providers, they're able to hear that maybe their understanding is not the whole of truth. And so that takes pastoral care providers being able to be in that intentional relationship with that person to help them to hear it. Because I'll tell you what, telling somebody that their understanding of truth is not the whole of truth has never worked. This doesn't work. People got to get there themselves. And to get there themselves, they need the space and the relationship that is pastoral care to be able to do that. And in what ways are we changed as a community? Asking, I'm thinking of one particular congregational conflict that I was involved in Delaware, where it was a lay pastoral care provider. We were doing a circle process, and everybody was passing a talking stick and sharing for a few minutes what their experience of the conflict had been. And it was a lay pastoral care provider who, because they were running it, and I was there bearing witness. I had helped to train them in circle process, but they were running that program themselves, that event themselves. And it was, when talking stick came back around, the lay pastoral care provider who was facilitating said, the question she asked next was, how are we different because of this conflict? How have we changed? And naming that in the community was probably the most healing thing that could have happened. And in all these ways, we enlarge the we to include all those in need in crisis. And there are lots of people in need in this crisis that are not in a narrow understanding of our we. One of the things that's been fascinating to me is that a lot of people are attending our online worship services that don't normally sit in our pews. As we've transitioned many of our congregations into doing online worship, there are a lot of people who are coming to those services, who are attending because they are in need, who we've never seen in our buildings. How do we enlarge the we? So, Lisa, I'm going to stop there and ask if there's any questions in the chat.
Yes, there are. There are a couple from Gail. Gail, first of all, wants to know, she says, I work with a mentally ill man. What he wants is a friend. Is that pastoral care or something else?
I think it depends if you are making it about him, if you are making it an experience for him, then that can be pastoral care. I'm going to give you an example. I had a patient when I was a hospice chaplain in Chicago. I had a patient who had a type of dementia where it was a type of regression dementia, where she was becoming mentally in her mind and in her self-image, becoming younger. And by the time I became her chaplain, she was effectively 18, and the year was somewhere around 1919. And what she needed me to be, it's a little embarrassing that I'm telling this story, but what I realized she needed me to be was a gentleman caller. Because she would sit in the parlor in her dress and with her gloves, and I would come in, and the healthcare worker would pretend to be the servant who would bring me in to sit at this little table with her, and we would share tea, and we would talk. And she would tell me about her day, and she would tell me, and then I would leave, and then a week later I'd come back and do the same thing. She needed me to be that gentleman caller in her mind. But for me, it was not that she was my friend. I was providing the pastoral care. So the distance, the thing that you need to hold into, he may need a friend. You need to remain a pastoral care provider. Gail, does that get you a little bit?
Oh, just a second. I can unmute you, Gail. Just a sec. You cannot, but I can.
And I don't know that we need to. Gail could
okay.
Gail
I was trying to figure out how to do a thumbs up, and I can't find it. So.
Gotcha. Thank you. So was there another question, Lisa?
Yes. Gail asks one other, and that is, and then there's another one after that as well. She says, we are contacting seniors in the congregation just to check in. Any advice in that scenario?
Listen, I think that's the first thing I would say is listen. Don't check in with a list of all of the congregational webinars and online programs that they can attend. Have that if they ask for it, but just call in to listen. I mean, we're right now in my military unit doing the same thing. We're calling all the families of the soldiers that are deploying, and the first act that we wanted to do was give them a list of all the resources, to start the call with a list of resources that they could reach out to. And I said, stop. No, just call and ask them how they're doing, and then listen. If they need stuff, they'll tell you, right? You can listen with an ear, however, for what they may need. And you can listen for an ear for where there may be connections. I wonder if one of the things that you could do that would be pastoral is to connect them with other people who are also feeling senses of isolation in this time. But my first advice is don't come with a plan, come with a listening ear and let them guide you to what they need.
I'd like to add something in there. One of the things that I learned from our colleague Sharon, who was meeting with a group of people, ministers actually, to talk about what was going on. And these were people she had relationships with. So this is probably a great question once you have a relationship with someone. But her question was to have people tell a story from their ancestry of when one of their ancestors had exhibited resiliency. And by what happened with hearing those stories was people began to realize that they had in their own history a way to be resilient in much of this. So thank you, David, for letting me chime in. And then Susie wanted to know, she says, CISM or CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management, right? How can I use that in my position as a moderator of a caregiver support group?
That's interesting. And the answer is I'm going to ask you to email me and we have an offline conversation. I think that, It may be that system is too involved for that because it takes a lot of training to do well. But there may be something similar that might be useful. And so I'll engage that. I'm going to move us, and we've done a lot of the theory piece, the I, thou, we piece, and I invite you to just to hold, even if all you get from that is asking yourself the question, how am I in this conflict? How are thou in this conflict, in this crisis? How are we in this conflict and crisis? Or even if all you remember is the hand motions, right? I, thou, we, right? But I want to give a couple tools, especially for crisis and conflict pastoral care. And both of these tools are about you remaining centered. The first one is one that actually comes from, it's derived from some teachings by a Buddhist, Shambhala Buddhist nun that some of you may have heard of. Her name is Pema Chodron. It comes in particular from a program that she did for activists, for social justice activists in the time period of the run-up to the Iraq War that was titled Practicing Peace in Times of War. And what she said is that there is a practice of bearing witness that allows you to remain centered. She starts off by talking about hooks. Now, hooks are things that are out there in the world that when they are fished in front of you, something deep within you causes you to bite that hook and get swept away. Now, I know that one of my hooks are people who cut me off on the road. Somebody cuts me off while I'm driving, like really close, and I got to like slow down or even swerve. It just, my body just tenses up, and I just get all, my wife says I like grow by 6 inches in every direction. I get all, and I just want to charge at them, right? Which is not a good plan driving a car on a highway, right? So I know that that's a hook. I also know another hook of mine. This one's much smaller, is that my name is David. It is not Dave. It is not Davy. Somebody calls me Dave or Davy, and I feel this hook that you all get what I'm feeling. My sister knows this. Our family members know our hooks, right? My sister knows this, and so what does she call me whenever she gets a chance? She calls me Davy, Davy. I'm the oldest. Where did this come from? I don't know. So everybody get what I mean by hooks. There are those things, and sometimes the hooks are big. Sometimes the hooks are. I mean, I have a hook related to genocide from my time in Bosnia. I've stopped posting on Facebook because Facebook has been used for genocidal purposes in other parts of the world. And sometimes our hooks are profound. Sometimes our hooks are based in our own trauma, our own experiences. But we all have them. And sometimes they're little and sometimes they're huge. So the first step is try and begin to see and figure out what your hooks are. What are the things, especially in pastoral care? I learned it when I was doing pastoral care in hospitals that there was a hook that I had. I didn't know I had. And it's a phrase that people would tell me all the time. I was a chaplain in a hospital in East Tennessee. And the phrase was, God will not give me any more than I can handle. And gosh, did that drive me up a wall, right? Because God gives people more than they can handle all the time. I wish we lived in that world. And so I had to learn that when somebody said that, it was inappropriate for me to then go, that's not true at all. Don't believe that. That is not pastoral care. Right? So how do I recognize the hook? The first step in avoiding a trap is knowing of its existence. So the first step when I do this work with people and is to start thinking about what your hooks are. Maybe make a list and write down the things, because you know when you're hooked. You may know it 3 days later that you were hooked, but you know when you're hooked. So just create a list and start writing down those things that hook you in your life, but also in pastoral care. Right? Start writing those down. And recognize that energy. Recognize that feeling that comes with being hooked. That drive. I'm gonna move us a little bit. We know what those feelings of being hooked are. You like that picture? Anybody have a fear of heights? Anybody get hooked by heights? Some of us probably do. That person up there jumping from one telephone pole to the other, that is Chaplain George Tiger, a Unitarian Universalist minister, when we were doing a high wire course together a couple years ago. So invite and think about, what are those things that hook you? Now, there's this amazing thing about the human body that, and this is not new knowledge. Religions have known this forever, and mothers have known this longer. But I like to tell people why it works. We always say, whenever you start feeling that energy, whenever you start to get angry, whenever you, the wisdom is, take some deep breaths, right? I learned as a child that the moment my mother started doing, I had done something wrong. So we know that this is the ancient wisdom. But here's why it works. There are two different aspects of how our body functions. One of them is called autonomic, and the other is somatic. Autonomic parts of our body are those parts of our body that function without us having to think about it. I don't have to go beat heart, beat heart, beat heart. My heart just beats. Hopefully it continues to do that, right? But I do have to tell my arm, although I talk with my hands, so I don't know how much they're in control, but I do have to tell my arm, raise arm. My arm just doesn't do this automatically, right? I have to send a signal to do that. So the things that happen automatically, we call that autonomic. The things that take some volition, that need some level of signal from the brain, we call those somatic. There are two parts of our body that are both, that happen automatically and that we can take conscious control over. One of them is on the screen, right? It's breathing, right? The other, bonus points if anybody can guess the other. You can put it in the chat, and Lisa can tell me who gets it first. Anybody, Lisa? I don't see chats coming in. Nobody? All right, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to show you. You ready? Anybody get it now? Blinking.
Yes, someone posted blink. That was George, and then Judah also got blink. So
Right. So breathing and blinking are those two things that happen automatically without conscious volition that we can then take conscious control over. And one of the things that we've learned is that act of taking one of those systems, the breathing or the blinking system, taking conscious control of it, it short circuits the process of biting that hook and getting swept away. It buys you time. So I teach to pastoral care providers, because if you're sitting there with someone and you're listening to them and all of a sudden you start blinking at them, that's weird, right? So I teach to pastoral care providers breathing, conscious breathing. So everybody, I want you to try it with me. We're going to do a military version of this. Oh, you like my little, the origami crane? Did you all see that? This is what I teach people in pastoral care. Let's say somebody has just said something that is so contrary to your values, you are starting to bite that hook and get swept away, and you need to find a way to remain centered in that moment to them, because they are the purpose. Pastoral care is intentional compassion within boundaries, representing the faith community. And you need to be there not as you, but as representing the faith community in that moment. So you move into a little conscious breathing, and it's just this easy. Try it with me. In through the nose, 2, 3, 4, out through the lips, 2, 3, 4. In through the nose, 2, 3, 4, out through the lips, 2, 3, 4. We just did it twice. Anybody feel calmer yet? Feel a little more centered? Right? This is ancient wisdom. We know this works, but the key of this process is you've got to recognize the hook. You got to know that something just happened that is going to get you all upset or angry and is going to pull you out of being intentionally present with that person. So you breathe, and as soon as you recognize the hook, you then drop into the breathing. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe. And it doesn't have to be the 2, 3, 4. I teach that to soldiers because something about counting and being a soldier, they just got to have the counting. Funny, it's also true about Zen Buddhists, at least for a while. So but just taking that conscious control of your breath. Try it with me again, without the counting. Just take conscious control of your breath and breathe deeply. The funny thing is, I learned to do this as a pastoral care provider so that I could control my own reactions. But people read it as if my being thoughtful. It's wonderful. It's got two benefits there. So I'm going to move us because I'm talking a little too much in this workshop. Paying attention to the things that hook you will tell you about you. I have a deep value of respect that I know because I get hooked by people cutting me off on the highway. I have a deep value for human life because I know I get hooked when there's some genocide happening in the world. Your hooks will teach you about you. We're not going to practice a hook today, but just look for the next time that you have a hook happen in your life and see what happens in your body. See what you experience, and then try the breathing. Because our brain is designed to react to trauma, to react to stress. Those parts we call the frontal lobe, those are the most, and I'm in a setting, I love that I'm teaching this with Unitarian Universalists because I'm in a setting where I can talk about evolution and I don't lose half the audience, right? So those parts where we think, they developed the far latest in our evolutionary history, and they operate the slowest. The mammalian and the reptilian parts of our brain operate, depending on who's saying, thousands of times faster than those thinking parts of our brain. You all have experienced this. Have you ever heard a car backfire and then you move before you even know you had heard the car backfire? Right? We know what that experience feels like. Well, that's those earlier parts of our brain taking charge because there's a feeling that we're a threat. The same thing happens for people in congregational crises and in crisis times in our country. Helping people. And so what happens is that prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain, turns off to slow it, because that's running so slow, it'll just slow us down. So it's a survival mechanism when you see people no longer able to think, when they're just reacting. And that is a useful survival mechanism when the tiger is actually coming at you. It's not a useful survival mechanism in coffee hour. So lay pastoral care providers, by providing a space where people can process, they can slow down, and they can talk, are helping people to come back into the community. Does this make sense? You all can't tell me, but we're going to move forward because I promised we would have a little time. This is the worst named thing ever, but I'm going to name it for a second. There is a level of anxiety in our lives below which we have no motivation to change. Things are perfect, why would I change anything? There is a level of anxiety in our lives that above it, our brain turns off, the prefrontal cortex is no longer working, and we can't function. It is in the space between that almost all human adaptation and change happens, which in this slide is called the productive range of distress. Anxiety is not bad. Anxiety is what keeps us alive and drives all change in human beings. Our job is not to remove all anxiety. Our job at times is to help someone be more anxious so they're motivated to change. At other times is to help them draw their anxiety down so that they can function. This model helps us to know what our role is, especially in crisis and trauma, in helping people to process through that crisis and trauma. Last thing we are going to do, and I'm going to end up doing it pretty quickly because we've taken a little longer than I planned for this workshop. And that is question-focused listening. This is actually really easy. Who has heard, you can raise your hands, who has heard of active listening? Anybody heard of active listening, had training in active listening? There are multiple forms of active listening, listening in which you can reframe. I will tell you, please, please, please do not ever use the form of active listening where you say, repeat to someone, what I hear you telling me is. That worked when nobody knew what you were doing. Now everyone knows what you're doing and it's just annoying. Question-focused listening is a way of doing active listening, accomplishing the same thing, but that really, really helps you as the listener to not interject your own processes, issues, or stories into the experience. The core of question-focused listening, first I want to tell you where it came from. This is the type of listening that we train U.S. Army chaplain assistants, what we now call religious affairs specialists and sergeants, who are, a chaplain assistant is at their, one way to understand them, and I have one here with me right now. He's in a room in the hotel over there. They're like having a church secretary, a highly energetic 20-something church secretary who has a firearm. Because I, as a chaplain, do not carry a weapon. I'm precluded from the Geneva Convention from doing so. So they're our force protection. They're the people that keep us chaplains alive. My first two, Amanda Fuller and Eric Kinnigan, taught me this type of listening, and I'm sharing it with you all. So if the person, in question-focused listening, if the person is telling you their story, just let them. If they've got no problems telling you their story, just let them talk, and you listen, and pay attention, and keep eyes focused on them. Question-focused listening comes in when someone is having trouble telling their story, which often happens in times of crisis and trauma, especially when their anxiety is through that productive zone of disequilibrium. When they're either the prefrontal cortex is not functioning in the right way. You, as the listener, then guide them, encourage them to telling their story by asking fact-based questions. Neutral as possible, fact-based questions. When I teach this, I say who, what, when, where, rarely how, and never why. Who, what, when, where, rarely how, and never why. Because there is never a why question that is not a value judgment. Or almost never. And most how questions are value judgments. So non-value judgment questions. Who were you with? What happened? When did you find out about it? Where were you? You hear all those? Why were you there? How did you think that was a good idea? Right? Which are not neutral questions. So question-focused listening, who, what, when, where, rarely how, and never why. You get the basic premise? You ask short questions to guide them into continuing to tell their story. The question is just an anchor that they can attach to. It also does the thing active listening does. Because to ask good who, what, when, where questions, you've got to be paying attention. You're informing them, you're letting them know that you are listening by asking those questions. And make your questions as short as possible, preferably just a few words. Let them make the meaning. Especially in crisis and trauma is not the time, when responding to crisis and trauma, is not the time to help people do deep meaning making. What you are looking to do is to help draw forth their story. Meaning can come later. Help them tell their story. If you're confused by a fact that they've shared, ask a short value neutral question. So were you alone when you found out, or were you with someone? That's actually a question someone asked me when 9/11 happened. And I went through a whole day not knowing because I was working on a paper and had everything turned off. You avoid telling stories of your own. You be aware of your body language and tone to be as neutral as possible. Do not question or challenge any meanings that they may share. Once again, crisis and trauma is not the time to do meaning work. There will be space for that. It's the time for them to externalize their experience, to externalize their story, to share it. Share resources on physical needs as appropriate. We talked about the 4-count breathing exercise and knowing what your triggers are, what your hooks are. And keep the listening. Good crisis listening usually is less than 30 minutes. Because that's about how much energy someone has to be able to engage it. We're not going to do the listening exercise, but it's going to be in the notes. So that when I'll have these slides tomorrow, this is an exercise you all could do in your pastoral care teams as part of a development training. We talked a little bit about why this works going through the process.
So David, we're at about 1 minute before you wanted to end. So I just wanted to do that time check.
Thank you. And last thing I'm going to share is that there is time management and energy management in crisis. You need to worry less about how much time you're taking, although I did say 30 minutes before, but also paying attention to how much energy you have as a lay pastoral care provider. I'm going to let that one just sit, and thank you all for coming today. I know that I said it would be an hour, and I had my timing off. I am available. I'm going to stay on the call afterwards. If there's anyone, we can unmute Lisa as people are leaving. If there's anyone who has questions they want to engage afterwards, I will stay on the call for those. And I am grateful for your all's attendance tonight. Remember, you can email me at dpile@uua.org. You can also reach out to any member of the regional staff. And I am grateful for your willingness to provide pastoral care in this time to the members of your congregation. Blessed be, go in peace.
Thank you so much, David, for doing this. I have now made it possible for people to unmute themselves if you do have questions for David, and we'll stick around as, well, not as long as you might want if it turns out to be 3 hours, but for the next while.
I do have to get up at like 5:30 tomorrow morning to go do Army stuff. But beyond that, however I can engage questions.
David, do you have, going back to one of the questions on an early slide about, how do we do pastoral care remotely?
Yeah.
I mean, I know how to do it on the phone, but any tips about doing it using something like Zoom?
I do pastoral care on Zoom quite a bit, both with congregations because I can't travel everywhere all the time. The first thing is you got to listen deeper. One of the things that I know I make sure I do is that I get to as quiet a space as I can, remove distractions from the area that I'm going to be talking to the person from. We don't have children, so it's a little easier for me, but I asked my wife, I said, I'm going to be in my office doing some pastoral care for the next little while, and we quiet the space down, limit interruptions. There's often many distractions, and I know in Zoom I want to go out and work on other things too. It's really pay attention, eyes to the person, even through Zoom. Look at them. Don't look around or anything like that. Look at them. And the last one is the one I said before. Zoom works for pastoral care much better when you've been in person with that person in the past. It's harder to build a pastoral care relationship over a medium like Zoom when you don't have a store in you of what their body language is like. The majority of human communication is body language. It's not the words we say. And so you can, and I often found that I could do Zoom pastoral care, but every once in a while I needed to find a way to get some of that body language back.
And I just want to add too, for some people, Zoom is exceedingly uncomfortable.
Right.
And because having somebody stare at them or feel that they have to stare. And so I often would offer, would you like to do Zoom, or is phone more comfortable for you? Which is possible. And
also, I'll add this to what Lisa said. Phone works. phone pastoral care works really well. I will tell you this with some of my soldiers. They want to do on so I work a lot with Roman Catholic priests, just so you know that. And they'll use the phone like many Catholics will use the confessional because they don't have to look at me.
Mm.
They can speak to my younger soldiers use text that same way, right? So they'll text me things they would never say to me even on the phone, but they'll text them to me.
And women are socialized to talk face to face. Men are often socialized to talk next to each other.
Right.
And so you might find that you have a better response, like when they're sitting at the bar or walking along or things like that. So part of it is really make sure that you offer those options.
So thank you. So what other questions might there be? I will say that there is online. I recorded it last week or week before that? I don't remember. But I recorded a webinar on basic lay pastoral care that is now online on uua.org on what boundaries of care look like and how you establish what boundaries of care are. There is also a webinar, there's a workshop that is just the slides online on Leader Lab on uua.org on how to build pastoral care programs. I did one, but also a very good one was done by our colleague, Sarah Gibb Millspaugh, more recently on how you build pastoral care programs in this time of pandemic and crisis.
And let me just tell you a tour of the UUA website in case you don't know how to find these things. If you go to uua.org, any resource that we believe will be helpful to anybody during the time of COVID-19 has had a tag with that. So in the upper left corner of the website, there is a link where you can click on and it will send you to a page where you can find any of the resources for this pandemic time. There's one link right in the first set that says everything that has this hashtag. And if you click on that, you can scroll through the things. There's probably about 130 resources that have been developed or curated. You can also, for the Leader Lab, I find the easiest way to do it is just in the search box on the uua.org website to type in Leader Lab. And there you will find resources on almost anything that you want to do in your congregation, including the webinars and the resources that David mentioned.
So are there any other questions? Thank you, Lisa. Are there any other questions that are out there?
There's lots of thank yous that have been posted in the chat, David. I just want to make sure you know that.
Thank you. And if there aren't any questions, we will bless all of us upon our way. So thank you all for coming out tonight. Have a beautiful day. Know that you can reach out to us, and I'm sure I will get to see you again soon. Be well and blessed.
Goodbye, everyone.